Hi, I am Carolyn Gage, and I am a playwright, and I'm here with Chris Jennings, who is a descendant of the famous playwright Lynn Riggs, who wrote Green Grow the Lilacs, which is the play upon which the smash hit blockbuster Oklahoma musical was based. And we are going to have a conversation today, and I actually titled it. So here goes. Intergenerational trauma refracted through the playwriting of Lynn Riggs and his descendants. And our conversation is going to be in two parts. I am starting with my dramaturgical analysis of Riggs' play and the Green Grow the Lilacs and the way in which trauma informs that play, and then also how that play was kind of appropriated for the Broadway musical. And then Chris is going to talk about his extensive research into the Riggs family and take a look at the roots of intergenerational trauma as it played out generation after generation, and particularly in his own situation. He's a third generation, a cousin of Lynn Riggs. So first, let me just do the little talk about Green Grow the Lilacs. And this was a play that was written in 1931. It's important to remember that because the Depression was kind of in full bore at that point. It's a play that became the basis for Oklahoma and that opened in 1943, which was a completely different world. It was the middle of World War II. And Oklahoma still today, 80 years later, is a staple of American mainstream theater, especially musical theater. I was really shocked when I read Green Grow the Lilacs because not only was it very different from Oklahoma, but it was different in really significant ways, like core, to me, core ways. It subverted the central themes of the play. And a note here, what was very faithful was the characters. I felt like the characters that were in Green Grow the Lilacs, with their dialect and a lot of their dialogue, actually was in the musical. Kudos for that. But the reshaping of the narrative to me was a shock. Green Grow the Lilacs, first of all, is not about Oklahoma. It takes place in 1900, and Oklahoma is not a thing. It's not a state yet. It takes place in Indian Territory, which was all of the land west of the Mississippi, not including Missouri or Louisiana or the territory of Arkansas. And so what we know as Oklahoma today was Indian Territory. It was admitted to the Union in 1907. Lynn Riggs was born, I think, in 1900 or 1899. Can't remember.
1899.
Yeah, okay. So
Yep.
yeah, he's 8 years old
Yep.
before his land is considered the state of Oklahoma.
Correct.
And so that right there is kind of a shocker because the musical is titled Oklahoma, and it's a huge celebration of statehood. You know, that is the magical thing that happens. Now, the musical opened in the middle of World War II, and it was really unapologetically, flag-wavingly cheerleading about the USA as this land of morality and opportunity. This is what the boys are fighting for, and this wide open land, just thrown open, full of promise and opportunity, was just waiting for them to come back. And then, of course, the 50s would happen. It's a really robust musical celebrating a settler's perspective. But Riggs's play, which was written more than a decade earlier, was in the throes of the Depression, and it's very different. He's not celebrating the coming statehood. His characters are proud and explicitly proud to have indigenous blood. They say that in the dialogue. And they actually, this was the shocker, they consider the US like a foreign country full of foreigners. I'm going to quote the central character, Aunt Eller, the matriarch of the play. And Chris is later going to tell us about the actual antecedent for Aunt Eller. She said, "Why, the way you're siding with the federal marshal, you'd think us people out here lived in the United States. It's just a foreign country to me. And you supporting it, just dirty old foreigners, every last one of you." That is a really different message from Oklahoma, which is like, can't wait to be part of the states, whoopee. The musical erases the indigenous presence, and it also erases this the very proud autonomy of the pioneers who are living free in the territories. It really was kind of, wide open space and homespun systems of justice, and they're proud of that. And Lynn makes that really clear. That's what he's celebrating in Green Grow the Lilac. The second appropriation is personal and community based. And this is really, to me, the dramaturgical heart of Green Grow the Lilac. So there's this pioneer ritual around the turn of the century, probably earlier, and it was called chivalry. And chivalry is an artifact of rape culture that has its roots in a European tradition whereby kind of roaming bands of young men would ambush people and parade them through the streets. And the people they chose to ambush and parade through the streets were members of the community who failed to conform to sexual norms, specifically gender roles. Their targets were remarried widows. I didn't know that was a thing, but apparently that's a little sus. Childless couples, women who assaulted their husbands, even if it was in self-defense, and prostituted women. So this was kind of a medieval a way to let off steam in a community, a way to bring people in line behaviorally. Terrifying. It just makes me think of Klan activity in the South. And it's done at night, yeah. In the chivalry of the 1900s in Riggs' play, and he makes it clear this is a thing in the community. It's a tradition. It involves a customary hazing of newlyweds the night of their wedding. And the couple is abducted by a gang of men under cover of darkness, and they are paraded and they're subjected to vulgar and indecent suggestions and catcalls. And the bride is threatened or actually experiences being groped, stripped, and sexually humiliated. The purpose is her sexual humiliation and also demonstrating the impotency of her husband because he's restrained while this is going on and has to watch. It is an initiation of the couple, and a very brutal one, reminding them that the community, and by that I mean the men, comes first, that the primary allegiance is always going to be between the men. It's a brotherhood, and now they've all symbolically had the bride, so that they can't have an exclusive bond that exists apart from the brotherhood. The brotherhood has appropriated the wedding. So the chivalry occurs at night. It's terrifying. In the play, it ends in an attempt to burn down the farm, and it ends with the death of a man who is there. In the musical, it's a rowdy, good-natured, post-wedding, middle of the day send-off, kind of like when the groomsmen go tie shoes around the back of the car. You would never understand that the chivalry is something married couples would go to great lengths to avoid, and that was particularly terrifying to the women. And in the musical, yes, there's a villain. He acts badly during the chivalry, and he dies. In Green Grow the Lilacs, the trauma of the chivalry, which is this gang rape type of ritual, profoundly affects the bride, who's the ingenue, Laurie. And we've seen her very carefully depicted as a sunny, confident, healthy girl. She's now afraid to leave her room. She's not eating. She has dark circles around her eyes. She's haunted by the memory of the sexual threats and also the eyes of the dead man. And she says over and over, the way the men done, the things they said, oh, why did it have to be that way? And then Aunt Eller tells her there's things you can't get rid of and you just have to learn to live with them. And these are the key speeches of Green Grow the Lilacs. Laurie, processing the trauma, concludes, well, now I feel sure of something anyway. I'll be growed up like everybody else. I'll put up with everything now. You don't have to worry about me no more. And that's not a healthy response to trauma. That's kind of a post-traumatic shutdown situation of like, yeah, whatever. It's like, to me, she's sort of announcing the death of her spirit, which was the point of the chivalry. And the colonization of the Oklahoma Territory and the breaking of the spirit of Laurie are thematically entwined in the play. And the ending is not triumphant by any means. The husband is arguably going to be assumed guilty of this death. And so they're waiting for trial to find out, and it's very unresolved. In the musical, they have a spur of the moment frontier justice town hall, and he's declared free to go. And they're all good, like everything's forgotten and forgiven. They've exorcised the deviant guy. This is not true with Green Grow the Lilacs. The trauma is ongoing. It's just the beginning, as Laurie indicates, as well as, and the impending statehood is framed that same way. So anyway, I wrote this blog because I've had that experience with my work when it's been taken over by commercial theater. They will often go to the heart of something feminist or the trauma and completely rework it, often in a way that undermines and subverts the whole message. So Ann Riggs's mother was 1/8 Cherokee, which enabled her to officially qualify as Native in terms of receiving a land allotment. And Riggs was, on top of indigenous ancestry, he was also gay. He was an artist and an intellectual. And no doubt he had father issues. His father was a rancher and a banker. And of course, in 1910, 1920, being a gay male on the frontier had to have been hellish. He's not a big burly guy. He's kind of premature balding thing, looks a little bit with the glasses, kind of like an egghead intellectual.
Very
Um,
much.
yeah, it seems like his life didn't get started till he got himself to Santa Fe. Like, phew, thank God, an art colony. But I
Well,
have since reading the play, just one second, that
yeah,
had a personal experience of hazing, harassment, kind of a frat boy initiation that obviously chivalry wasn't in his experience, but I felt like he's trying to unload something here from his own past. Go ahead.
no, that's a phenomenal introduction. The thing that I love discovering about Lynn Riggs, because this is something that's only that I've unearthed in the depth that I've done in the past 5 years. I grew up with very little information about this family ancestry. I didn't ever really do any kind of reading, or I never really I never paid any mind to who Lynn Riggs was. And I was estranged from my father for many years, for roughly 20, 22 years. We unfortunately didn't even, I wasn't able to say goodbye to him before he passed away. However, he never shared with me his childhood in Oklahoma. And, he left a lot of clues, and he did sort of tell me little bits and pieces along the way, but he never gave me the full story. And it's only been in the past 5 years that I've really uncovered the full story, which is quite, it's really shocking in many respects, but it's also it's very comforting in many other respects, because for someone who has worked through their own trauma and knew that it definitely was part and parcel of this just lineage, and how trauma can sometimes be passed, special mental illness can pass along through things generationally. To understand, the origins of that has been a phenomenally calming experience but one of it's a settling. It's kind of like your foundation is finally, you finally finished your masonry work, I guess.
To me, it's kind of like a health history. I have
Yeah,
been adopted, and it causes all
yeah,
kinds of problems when you can't find out, did your mother have breast cancer? Did your
yeah.
parents have heart attacks?
That's
It
a
just,
good way of putting it.
and I think that to know, um, yeah, to know your trauma history makes a great deal of difference. I had a friend who was she had a publishing company, and she didn't drive, which is a good, fine for her, but it was weird. And she found out at a family funeral that her family was actually Jewish, and they had aggressively told her they were Presbyterian and been very vague about where they came from in Europe, and they'd come from Germany,
Oh
and
well.
I think it survived Kristallnacht. And she
Oh,
uncovered this whole trauma history, and they were just clear their family was going to be raised not knowing anything about that, sheltered for,
yeah.
and she embraced her Judaism and really did what you did, researched the history. And really, one of the first things she did, she just went out and got her license and started driving. And I don't know what the connection was, but there was a connection there. And suddenly it was like, this isn't my trauma.
Yeah.
I don't have to do this. Something was, it released something in her. The not driving maybe belonged to someone
That's
else's
amazing.
fear.
Yeah, what was really fascinating for me is it was literally 5 years ago, and it's I'm so grateful to have been able to connect with this man. My cousin Richard Rogers, who descends from one of these children that my great grandmother or my great great grandmother, Mary Elizabeth Riggs Thompson Bryce, who is the model for Ann Eller, who Lynn was taking care of when he was growing up, because Lynn's own birth mother, Rosella, passed away, I believe, in 1901 or 1902, when Lynn was very young. He was 2 or 3 years old. There is a photograph of the family that's a very popular photograph. It's included at the Claremore Museum of History, which has a phenomenal, they have the bulk of the sort of physical archives of Lynn's personal effects and things. And a few relatives have passed away in the past, 5 years, that have left a lot of amazed, a lot of, more of his personality and sort of the things that uncovered a lot of the, it was only supposed to be sort of let known to the public officially that he was gay in 2017, I believe.
Oh my God. Oh my
Um,
God.
everybody knew it. I mean, they even knew it when they were putting the flag over his coffin in 1954, when he was the first Oklahoman to ever have a state funeral with a flag over their coffin. There's never been any, he never publicly came out, but there was never any doubt that he was not heterosexual. But for whatever reason, the family just didn't want it to be known. And I was never close with any of those family members. And it's not something that I'm looking to sort of, point a finger at to anybody who's currently alive, because the family that's currently alive so far that I've met are absolutely wonderful. And they're just, we're friendly on social media, and they understand what I'm doing and the purpose of my documentary and all of this. And I'm
Well,
not
let me
trying.
cut in. I didn't
Yeah,
say that. Chris is actually producing a documentary
yeah.
about this family tree
Trying
from.
to trying to get there. I've pretty much, every time I think I'm finished with my research, I uncover something else. And I've gotten to the point, with when you make a documentary, you want to leave enough sort of on the table so that you can have, the interviews sort of guide you in certain places in case information comes to light, because obviously, there's only so much that you can really uncover But what's fascinating, and this is the part that, I think just really blows my mind, because none of the other living relatives that are aware of, Riggs' impact in his writing, and I say that with the exception of one cousin, who is Laura, whose name is Laura Heidinger, who grew up in the theater and is currently still in the theater. She lives outside of Dallas with her family. She's from part of the family that descends down based on Laura Clementine Thompson, which is Laurie, the character in Green Grow the Lilacs. My great grandmother, Willie, is the character basis for Ado Annie. So, and then I discovered through research that, several other, well, basically most of Riggs' plays, in one of his, the only unfinished novel that was left incomplete at the time of his death in 1954, was a book called An Affair at Easter, which there are 3 parts of 5 written. And the fascinating thing about that is that it's about this traumatic event in the Thompson family when my great grandmother Willie's older brother Ray was shot by his wife in a rooming house that was owned by another older sister of Willie's named Doll, who owned the house with a man named Art Woods. And 7 years after the shooting, Doll passed away from tuberculosis, and then sometime after that, my great grandmother married Doll's husband. So there's all this crazy, sort of, it's kind of a soap opera, if you will.
Well, I was going to ask you, when you see,
Yeah.
when I hear family stories like that, my first
Yeah.
question is like, oh, so who's drinking?
Yeah. And anytime I start talking about the story, it gets very complex very fast, because at the very base of it, Mary Riggs, who Ann Eller, she had 11 or 12 children, several of which died before they were 7 years of age, but 8 of her children grew to be adults, and of these 8, there were 2 men and 6 girls, and they all had very colorful lives, both brought to life through Lynn Riggs' plays in the way that they were shaped in the narratives of those actual plays. But some of those actual narratives are based on real life events that.
Yeah, I was surprised to read that, like he really loved his Aunt Mary because she was the mother figure. She raised him. And tragically, he had a smoking accident or something. He burned down. Oh my God. That's like.
Well, there's 2, it's amazing. So Mary Riggs, as Phyllis Cole Bromlick inscribed in her biography about Lynn Riggs called Haunted by Home, one of those hardy, Oklahoma pioneers. And she was a fiercely independent woman. The photographs of her, there's this one photograph of her in a prairie dress on crutches, and she just looks like, she just beat up, 5 cowboys, punched the horses in the face, and mucked the stalls. And what else do you want me to do? Do you want some breakfast too? She just looks like a tough person. And all the women that I grew up, I knew my Aunt Mary, which was her granddaughter, and I didn't really know my grandmother very well. She passed away when I was only 3 years old. But my Aunt Mary was alive until I was in my teens, and she was a wild woman. She carried a gun in her purse, and she. We would sit in bed at night and listen to the police band radio, and she would, she'd drink a lot, and, when she, my Uncle Dale will say, well, when Aunt Mary drinks, she would turn into a little kid. She didn't get mean like, Grandma Willie. And I'm like, oh, well, tell me about Grandma Willie. And he's like, oh, Grandma Bill. So first thing I learned is that they all called her Aunt Bill or Grandma Bill, not Willie. And the stories about her are
No,
numerous.
she's Ado Annie, right? She's the model
Yeah.
for Ado Annie.
Yeah, and it's amazing how, there's an article that I mentioned in one of, my Substack pieces. Um, my dad would every so often something would come up in in the Tulsa World or a newspaper, and it would get passed around the family, and it would end up to me. And I, in the 30 years my dad and I had a relationship, he may have sent me, less than 6 articles. You know, I went away to school for boarding school in college, and I lived away from home a lot. So mail was a constant thing with him. The amount of mail he would send me was quite voluminous. Um, so, he would send me articles, clippings, all kinds of things to sort of, from popular culture, sports, you name it. And, I kept this one article from 1998, and it's, this is Uncle Howard, and it's Uncle Howard and another woman in the photograph, and the other woman happens to be the woman who was the ring bearer at my parents' wedding. So it's like these people in the family that, were connected in some tangential manner. But Uncle Howard was Laura McNeil. It's her son, and Laura McNeil being Lori. And so Uncle Howard was sort of the PR mouthpiece for the family for many, many years, for, several decades. And for many years, Lynn's sister, Maddie Cundiff, spoke on, sort of was the family mouthpiece for anything that, Riggs would, if the family was receiving any kind of honors. She received the plaque from the state, from the governor, things like that. And then, years later, you sort of see Uncle Howard, when the newspapers, when there would be a revival of Oklahoma or something like that, Howard McNeil would appear in the papers as being quoted for the Riggs family, or, for Lori. So these little bits and pieces I would collect over time, but, they don't really paint much of a picture until you read the plays and you see these narratives, and you hear the stories that my cousin Richard Rogers, who I connected with, via ancestry.com. And once, he connected the family trees together, and I saw how everything plays out, it's phenomenal.
I omitted to say that this Oklahoma territory that he
Yes.
grew up in, because he was 8 before it was really a state. It really was the Wild West, and it was that particular area was rife with bank robber gangs, the
Yeah.
Dooley
And
brothers, or but also, and this is a thing that only recently is really starting to be taught and talked about, the Tulsa riots, or massacres, I guess I could say, mass
yes,
lynching. That was 1921. And I was looking at that today and I'm thinking, but Lynn was probably not there. He was probably in college by then, because he would have been
he was
20.
in Norman, but if you remember in the Borowitz article, Uncle Howard McNeil is quoted because he's interviewed by Borowitz for that article. And McNeil talks about how he worked as a bank teller in William Grant Riggs Bank in Claremore, where the family, was firmly implanted across the town. And Howard talks about a guy who was a known KKK member came into the bank and talked about shooting a bunch of, people the day before over in Greenwood.
Oh my God. Well, I mean, I
And,
think again, it's like, and I
and,
want
I'm not saying this because I'm not trying to claim any gold star by any stretch, but I would say I probably knew about the Tulsa massacre. I mean, I knew about that when I was in high school. I heard about it, I would say, in the late 80s, early 90s. for the first time,
Yeah.
simply because I had relatives that were there, and they were like, wait until this gets out into the bigger, discussion of things, because it was still very, you would go to Tulsa, and I mean, there's a lot of things about Tulsa that we can get into that are phenomenally complex, that have to do with the very sort of, it's the heart of the military industrial complex, for the war machine. It's the heart of, the oil and gas industry in the United States, with the discovery of the Glenpool oil field in 1905, which is 2 years prior to statehood. No coincidence there, right? Um,
I wanted to read a statement that you emailed me, but I think it was in either the essay book or the biography. And
yeah,
this is what Lynn wrote about it. And I think to understand Green Grow the Lilacs, you really kind of have to sit with the historical context of what was going on in the territories. He said, when I was a child, and then, put it together with the alcoholism and being raised by, his aunt and all that.
yes.
When I was a child there, the country and the people were very dramatic. A primitive violence was always close to the surface, always apt to break out at any moment. It was all about me. Under a sometimes casual exterior, there was a fever and a thrumming. Just by accident of nerves, I suppose, I was always conscious of this hidden excitement. And I feel some of that's being a gay male, which is like, living behind enemy lines your entire life. Now, I grew up in the 50s in the South, and my father was a controversial judge. We had a cross burned in the front yard, and my parents really tried to kind of shelter me from what was going on. But I really resonate with this primitive violence always close to the surface. And it's something that turns up in Shirley Jackson's Lottery. It's like, these are your neighbors, these are your friends. And then it's midnight and they've smashed your window in and they're, hauling you out of bed and taking your nightgown off. It's like, or in the case of, African American history, killing you. And this, that it's the mayor of the town, it's the policeman, it's this and that. And that's to me, it seems I get what he's writing about, that it was always there, a fever and a thrumming. And like, boy, if these people knew I was gay,
Well, and I think that that's something that, it's interesting how I find, I think Len Riggs was very, once he got to Santa Fe, he really understood himself sexually, and learned how to, from Witter Benner and Ida Rao and other people that were, I believe Ida Rao was there in Santa Fe, but other people that were, other artists and other people in the gay community of Santa Fe at the time. He learned how to, operate and behave in society, on one hand, freely, because he could do so in Santa Fe at the time. But I think he also learned how to sort of, the P's and Q's of, look, do this, don't do that, mind this. He learned from older people in the community about how to behave. The other thing that's really fascinating too, to go back to the history of the area, is, the specific area where Riggs is born, Claremore, which is what we know of today, was really known as Claremont. There was a mistake at the post office and then it became Claremore. In 1817, the Cherokee they actually massacred the Osage at the Battle of Claremore Mound, which is also known as, the Massacre of Claremore Mound. And I think the Massacre of the Cherry Moon, or the Strawberry Moon. But that happens in 1817, and that was, the Cherokee came in at night while the Osage warriors were away. They rape, murder, and kill all the women and children. The ones that could get away drowned in the water nearby. It was a complete and total massacre on a scale larger than the Tulsa massacre in 1921, which was not even, just a touch over 100 years later. But you look at what happened in that area of the country, in 1817, in that general vicinity, there's a large massacre between two indigenous tribes, one of which was indigenous, but had also been, coming there, 17 years later with the Indian Removal Act. So more moving into the area. Then you have in 1887, that's the demarcation line, I guess, if you want to call it. So when they initiate the Dawes Rolls, in order to be considered part of Cherokee Nation, you must be listed on one of the Dawes Rolls. And the caveat of the Dawes Roll is that you have to have lived in that area prior to 1887. And so there's a lot of people that, showed up in 1889. Well, in 1889, that's the land rush. And, there are people that arrived in the land rush that tried to fudge their documents to get onto the Dawes Rolls, because if you get on the Dawes Rolls, you could potentially get an allocation of property. And you see where this is all headed, right?
I think for people who don't know, the Oklahoma land rush was a day when, you just kind of lined up in town and the gun went off and everybody ran, and you could homestead if you staked out your land on that day. It's in the movie Cimarron, I think, opens with a image of it, people in horses and stagecoaches. Just, it's a land grab, a literal physical land grab.
Yeah, and they did it to, it was into Indian territory.
Exactly. It's like nobody owns this land. Yeah, and it was like,
and it was white encroachment. It was kind of like, I mean, from one perspective, it's colonization, in the preparation of potential who knows what. But you have the land run in 1889, and then you have relative sort of cohabitation, and from 1889 roughly until, I'd say, 1905, when they discover the Glenpool oil field, you have one of the most incredible sort of cohabitation of races of unbelievable prosperity in the country. And the history and the culture and the sort of the fabric and the folklore and the songs and the artwork, and just after the Civil War, the reason why Greenwood becomes such a popular area is because so many African American slaves came up from Texas into Oklahoma after the Civil War and settled into the Greenwood, into the Tulsa area.
That is really fascinating. I'm up here in Maine, and up north near the Canadian border is Acadia. And they did not have this racial violence with indigenous people either. Like, there was this cohabitation situation that was idyllic. And it sounds like you're talking about this was what was and this is, to me, it was interesting that Riggs in 1931 was making a point of, it's kind of an extraneous piece of conversation in the play. It doesn't seem to serve a purpose. He makes it explicit, like, this business of the US being foreign, and we've all got Indian blood in us, and like this pride in the fact that this is a racial mingling community.
And that's the part, I think, I don't want to say he was duped by Rodgers and Hammerstein, but, the line, the land that we come from is grand.
It's the opposite of green grow the lilacs.
It is, but you can draw a thread between the two, because Riggs would look at that line metaphorically and feel that he was really from the land. But I think, a couple of things that people forget about Lynn Riggs too, or at least, when people sort of look at him through the lens of history, they don't, he only lived in Claremore pretty much from the time he was born until he was about 17 years old. And then he only visited, I would say, probably sporadically throughout college. And then once he goes to Santa Fe, New Mexico in 1923, he pretty much keeps Claremore in the blinder.
In the rear view mirror. Well, he actually wrote Green Grow the Lilacs. I mean, you think of him out on the prairie. No, he was in France on a Guggenheim,
He
and he
wrote,
was
yeah,
hanging
yeah.
with incredibly cultured, erudite, expatriates and so
Well,
on.
he's, yeah, I mean,
So he's
Briggs,
romanticizing it, and he has a whole lot of folk songs, and the whole play is in this dialect.
yeah.
And you think like,
Well,
wow, you're kind of hanging with these European intelligentsia while you're writing this down home. We all are foreigners, and
well, in Riggs, the funny thing about Riggs, because he never gets mentioned in anything of, the expats and, the fame, Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Dolly, well, Dolly wasn't an expat. The Americans in Paris in the late 20s. Well, Riggs was sitting in the same room. He's at Le Dumago, and he decides, Paris is actually, he gets there, I think, in the wintertime, and he's like, it's cold, it's dreary, I hate this. Which you understand because he's from Oklahoma. It doesn't, it's probably, and he also has, he's got this tuberculosis. He's a bit of a delicate health person to some degree, I would think. He's not an athlete. He's, he knows how to ride horses, and he's apparently quite a horseman, but he doesn't write Green Grow in Paris. He writes it in Cannes-sur-Mer in the south of France, which is really a very, lovely little town. And he finishes it down there in a little, seaside, 1-bedroom apartment, and then I think he does some traveling. He goes to Spain and writes about some bullfights, and then takes the steamship back to New York, and he immediately, he turns it into the Guggenheim, and they think it's great, and it gets a lot of attention.
But also, I think regionalism was a huge thing at that time, and
But
sometimes I
yeah,
felt like, well, it's kind of like Lorraine Hansberry after Raisin in the Sun, and her next play was The Sign in Sidney Brewstein's Window, which was kind of about the hip movement of the beatniks and very intellectual. And people
yeah.
were like, no, they wanted mama on the couch, mama in the kitchen. And I feel like that he was a little bit, I felt like he kind of stuck with the regionalism, like that was his niche, and that's what they wanted. That's what the literary magazines wanted. Give us that authentic Oklahoma voice. But as you say, at this point, he's highly educated, and he's, on Guggenheim's, and he's on the Riviera, and it
I
just,
mean, I mean, he, I've talked to some scholars that have done a lot of research, on him that are in academia. One, Andy Couch, who is now in Norman, Oklahoma. He did most of the, he spent 2 weeks day in and day out with the archives at the Beinecke Library at Yale, where a huge amount of Riggs archives are being held. The archives are in 3 different libraries. They're at the University of Oklahoma, the Beinecke at Yale, and the Claremore Museum of History in Claremore. And Andy Couch did a lot of the, correspondence research to align the chronology of Riggs' travels. And there's another professor, James Cox, at the University of Texas in Austin, who has done a lot of work on Riggs' film, A Day in Santa Fe, which is which also came out in 1931.
I saw that. And by the way, you guys can Google that and see it on it's Vimeo or YouTube. Yeah, it's like a kind of home movie that he shot of a donkey going through Santa Fe.
It's regarded as the first Native American avant-garde film. It was shot on 16 millimeter. It was co-directed by a man named James Hughes. And the print, another relative, a man named Leo Cundiff, he kept the answer print in a freezer for 40 years, and they transferred it, and the copy that's been digitized on the Museum of History in Claremore, that's the best place to watch it. You can probably catch, they probably have a YouTube channel as well. It's really phenomenal. It looks amazing, and I hope that I can air the outtakes, because there's 15 minutes of outtakes that aren't even in the finished piece that are sitting on, that haven't even been seen by the public. And there's so much stuff about his life that's crazy. I mean, he went to the Eastern University Prep School in Claremore, which is known today as Rogers State University. And oddly enough, my dad was sent to the Oklahoma Military Institute, which was the incarnation in my father's time of Eastern University Prep. The school has evolved. I believe it's in its fourth incarnation as Rogers State University today. I believe it was something between Oklahoma Military Institute and Rogers State, but I can't recall the name. But anyhow, that when Riggs finished high school, his dad basically knew that he was, I guess no one's kind enough to sort of say, but I mean, I guess his dad knew that he was a homosexual, but for whatever reason at the time wouldn't support him, wouldn't pay for him to go to college, didn't feel that it would do him any good. So Riggs he hopped a freight train to work as a cowpuncher in freight yards outside of Chicago, in a stockyard outside of Chicago. I think I have that correct. And then from there, he gets to LA and works as a proofreader for the Los Angeles Times. And he also works as a horse wrangler for films out there at when he's like 17, 18 years old. But basically, there's this 3-year period of time between when he's 17 to 20 years old, and he makes his way from, Oklahoma to Chicago to LA to New York. He's friends with the transcontinental runner, Andy Payne, who's famous at the time. In 1928, he runs the Transcontinental Road Race, the fastest from LA to New York City. But he's a guy that Lynn grows up with, in the area. But Lynn had all these different jobs, and he does all these different things, but then he gets back to Oklahoma. He goes to university. He has this bout of depression or something, happens. He breaks up with his girlfriend. He gets sick with some kind of lung ailment, goes to Santa Fe. He gets attention at the Sunmount Sanitarium, and then meets a lot of people in the local artistic community, and ends up basically, I would say, between Santa Fe, Greenwich Village, New York City, and Shelter Island, those are the three, his three main residences outside of, his place in Studio City that he maintained off and
He was
on.
kind of traveling in gay enclaves, it seems like. Santa Fe was, and
Yeah,
Taos had a lot of lesbians. Mabel
well,
Dodge Lujan was out there, and a lot of women came out to Taos to liberate themselves because
yeah.
people didn't judge you. And then Santa Fe was a little bit more elite artistically, but it
And
was
he
the
was
same
going
kind
to,
of freedom.
Provincetown.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
Greenwich, and
hanging out with O'Neill, and I mean, he was, again, he's hanging out with all the major players of the time, but just didn't get the same level of attention for whatever reason.
I was kind of surprised how prolific he was, because reading his biography, he seemed like an extreme social butterfly. It's like you said, now he's here, now
He
he's there, now he's here, and he's teaching 6 weeks at this university and doing really short residencies, and then getting these things like the Guggenheim, which are limited amount of times you go to Europe, and the people, and I'm just like, when is he writing? Because
Lynn would be referred to today, if somebody didn't know his heritage and his background, they would say, "Oh my gosh, what a Southern gentleman!" Because probably he was always dressed to the nines. He always had a coat and tie, and that was the outfits of the day, of course, but this is a guy who didn't have any money. I mean, you have to understand, he he was constantly broke, borrowing money from friends, until Oklahoma, or until Green Grow the Lilacs is optioned by Rodgers and Hammerstein and put on the stage in Broadway in 1943. He he's a hustler by all respects, and his prolific nature, he worked in the theater, and in the 20s, and then the theater leads into he wants to work in the films, and so he does work in Hollywood and writes several feature films, and he even worked and did some work in TV. He worked in the Philco, I think it's called
Well,
the
at that time, a lot, I mean,
yeah.
film industry was recruiting heavily from stage writers.
Oh, you'd have to, yeah.
And I
And
think it's sad they don't today. I think that's why the deterioration of screenplays has happened. But so he was not alone. I mean, and Fitzgerald went out to Hollywood, and a ton of them went out to Hollywood, and most of them didn't really like that culture. If you really like
no,
stage,
no,
um,
and it's not a very, I think to your point, I think he might have been a bit of an intellectual and wanted to sort of swim in different circles in that respect. He did, when he was in Hollywood, though, he did get written up in the gossip columns quite a bit. There was one gossip columnist famously that suspected that he was dating Betty Davis, to which
right? Yes.
many other people were like, yeah, no, that's not the case. And it's kind of this tongue-in-cheek joke to a lot of people, like, this guy doesn't know who this man is, do they? um, um, which is really funny how everyone speaks about Riggs. I mean, one of the funnier things that my uncle says, and my uncle is not a racist, and he's not a homophobe at all. He's just a bit of he just thinks from the right side, which is not necessarily right. We were talking, I was telling him about this project, and he's going to be taking over the estate that handles that portion of the rights of the Riggs estate. It's going into his hands, because our cousin Bobby passed away a few months ago, and he's like, well, Chris, you know that he's gay, right? And I said, well, yes, of course I know he's gay, Dale. I've known that since, he's like, well, I mean, you can just look at the book cover and tell that he's gay. And there is the photo on the cover of Haunted by Home, he's wearing the concha belt, and he's got, kind of the thing, and he's sort of standing there. You look at it, and I remember looking at it when I was a 16-year-old in high school when I got the book, and I sort of thought to myself, okay, I'm not sure if I want to just run around and share this with all my friends, but I think times change. I think why my father never shared anything with me was largely because he was terribly homophobic, and I think that I think that was, well, not the whole reason. I think that was just one part of it. I think he also didn't like the fact that I think there were two things. I think one, his grandmother, Willie, Ado Annie, in real life was a pretty mean drunk, and was not, she was a professional card player. She ran these rooming houses, and then she would have she would have, gambling dens in the rooming houses, which is another, that's what the Domino Parlor, another one of Lynn Riggs' plays, is about. But in A Fair at Easter, Riggs writes about this rooming house called, I forget what it's called in the novel, but of the many different houses that the Thompson girls owned, one of which was my grandmother Willie, they were not brothels, but one or two rooms might have been rooms that been operated by a prostitute, or somebody of that nature, they would have gambling and, games, bridge and poker for money and things like that in the parlors at night. And this was all widely known in everyone in the family. And it was just kind of like what you did. And, the thing that what we kind of forget about in current, contemporary society is that this all went on during Prohibition. So it was between 1920 and 1933. And, imagine being in part of a country or in part of this country where you start out within 20 years, you start out, you're not even a state, you're just a territory. Then you become a state. Then you're told you can't drink alcohol. And then, and you run hotels and you run rooming houses. And I'm sure, a bar is probably a source of income, for the establishment. So, there's this constant fight with authority. And that definitely seeped down through my father. And I mean, that's something that, I'm not gonna, shy away from the fact that, I'm by no stretch, I'm not anti-government by any means at all, but, I'm not exactly, I hold them in question like every other good American should. But, I come from a line of people that, they settled an area of the country, some may say wrongfully, but whether they did or they didn't, whether the right or wrong of it is sort of something that everyone can sort of argue and have an opinion about. But the thing that is quite fascinating to me is just what was captured through his plays of what went on, and how I can connect my own family history through that, and it creates kind of like a super story, if you will.
It seems to me like one of the things that people like Lynn Riggs and myself do is we tell the family secrets.
Yeah.
And he's definitely talking about, I mean, I think the chivalry is a dirty, like clan rallies. It's a dirty secret of people that look wholesome in the daylight, or good upstanding community members. And then in the night, you see these really shady sides of them. And also telling the secret, like, we don't think statehood is a great thing. It's a foreign country coming in. That's how we're experiencing it. And I can't remember because I read him so long ago, but I read some of his other plays, and I felt like he's really he's pulling back the curtain on a lot of the myths, especially in his time, where it's cowboy and Indian movies. Like the lies about the settling of the West were especially egregious, even in my childhood, but especially in the 20s and 30s, and that he was really telling a different story, and one that's identified very much with the territories before they were a state. And I think that is interesting. And I do that with my life. And it seems like you are being very out about your family heritage and talking about.
Well, I think I mean, my mother's side of the family came over from Germany for the most part and settled into the Wisconsin area and became dairy farmers. And they go back into the mid 19th century there. My dad's side of the family is really fascinating, and in so much because I'm somebody that comes down through several people that there may not, the names on the birth certificates might not be the people that actually were the parents. And that's something that's quite interesting in what it does to somebody's mind in their own identity. And I think that was I think my dad growing up losing his, my dad never knew his father. His father was killed in World War II. And I discovered that, I just want to bring that up because it's the fascinating thing that I discovered in my research. In 1942, Riggs was he entered the service and was in the Signal Corps and was sent to Ohio, and he made training films for the Army. My grandfather Willard, who Riggs would have known about because Riggs grew up and was very close to Ado Annie, my grandmother. They were like brother and sister. They grew up in pretty much the same house. So Riggs would have known about his cousin's son-in-law, and Riggs was given leave to go from Ohio to New York City for the opening of Oklahoma in 1943, in March of 1943. And sometime in 1943, my grandfather, Willard Jennings, was shipped through New York to the European theater where he, loses his life in Anzio sometime in 1944. And I wrote a scene in my documentary that's a complete reenactment because I have no idea if this actually happened. And I mean, the chances of it happening are pretty slim. I mean, I'm sure somebody would have known the story at this point, but I write a scene about my grandfather and Lynn meeting in New York City before the play, and about Lynn explaining to my grandfather how this really isn't the story about the family. And he uses, I use the kind of the meeting in the bar to be the vehicle for the narrative of the whole documentary, which tells the real story of where all these plays and narratives come from. And I don't know, but and there's a lot of things about Claremore that are really fascinating. Another thing that I think not many people know about,
I'm just going to tell you, we're going to have to wrap up in about 3 minutes. So if you can.
This is fine. No. Pitcher, Oklahoma, which is northeastern Oklahoma, is an area that is now the largest Superfund site in the continental United States. It's a completely abandoned area, and it's where they mined lead and zinc pretty much starting around the 1900, and earlier, up until about 2000. I think they stopped officially in 2005, and everybody's been moved out. You can't live there anymore. It's gone. But all the lead that was mined out of that area was used to make bullets and armament for the war. And I just always found that to be incredibly ironic.
Yeah. Yeah. Lead as a killer, one way or the other, intentional or unintentional.
Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to thank you for this conversation. It's just so fascinating. Well, everything about Lynn Riggs, the world that he came from, and then his complete reinvention of himself as a gay man, in the 20s and so on. So I'm gonna stop the filming, and then we'll wrap up. So is there anything you want to close? I know I'd like you to that quotation we were talking about earlier.
Oh yeah, one of the more poetic lines that he's written is, "Loose in the world is a floating malice."
Wow. Yeah. Loose in the world is a floating malice. And with those words of Lynn Riggs, I encourage people to go out and read the original Green Grow the Lilacs, as well as his other plays. Thank you so much, Chris. And I'm going to end the recording now.